So, welcome to this webinar. This is actually version 2.0. The original live webinar, we had some technical issues, so I thought I would redo this. So, let's launch right into the PowerPoint and talk about how this material will make a difference in your life. So boosting our spirits and lowering our stress level obviously affects our happiness level. So being skilled at shifting our emotional state and lowering our stress level doesn't just have an impact on our happiness though, and our health, energy, and even our immunity. It also has huge impact on just how productive we are. You think about it. If you're feeling dispirited, if you're feeling fatigued and overwhelmed, you're not as productive as you are if you feel energized and confident and optimistic. Also, there's a lot of fascinating research on how emotional state affects creativity and our capacity to innovate. So the quality of your work in terms of its creativity is hugely impacted by your emotional state. And also, we can all relate to our ability to be rational and logical is directly related to our emotional state and our stress level. Also, though, at the risk of stating the obvious, that our emotional state directly affects our relationships. You think about it, when people are in a state of fear, they tend to be very me focused, very protective of themselves, their work, their stuff, their territory in the organization, et cetera, and much less likely to be thinking in terms of how can I help others. Obviously, the happier we are, the more positive our emotional state, we're much more patient with people, we're much more compassionate, empathetic, we're more likely to give people the benefit of the doubt. So these techniques and strategies that we'll be talking about will have a direct impact on your relationships. And also, last and certainly not least, if you're a supervisor, manager, or leader, your ability to be in an upbeat, positive emotional state versus stressed out and overwhelmed has a huge impact on your ability to lead others, to inspire them, to be a role model, to lead by example. So this is what we'll be talking about in this webinar. Number one, how to shift your emotional state to an empowered, I can do this state. And this is a really important technique or strategy to have, again, because of the impact that our emotional state has on all aspects of how we show up in our performance. Then we're going to talk about some really fascinating research on the number one thing you can do to boost resilience and stress hardiness. I came across this a few years ago, and I've been involved in the resilience field for 30 years, over 30 years now. And this is some really new and compelling research with huge practical implications, which is why I'm sharing it. This one thing can be a game changer. And then last but not least, how to tune your brain to recognize opportunities where you typically would only see chaos and crisis. So one of the challenges, whether it's a very personalized difficult time we're going through in life or a more universal, like everybody in your company or everybody in society is going through, it's natural for the human brain to focus on the danger, the pain, the drama, and not the opportunity. And so there's something that we can do to help our brain actually become tuned into seeing opportunity. So real briefly where this comes from, and I'm not going to turn this into a long, hey, let's talk about me snooze fest, but I think it is helpful to understand the origin of this. So at the professional level, my first involvement in this material was my first career as a clinician. And I did a lot of work both in the trauma field and then also mind-body medicine field. And my involvement in the trauma field got me fascinated by wanting to learn more about what happens to people at a biological level, at a physical level when they experience trauma so that it changes them forever. And, I understood the psychology of it, but I wanted to go even at a more fundamental level. As I delved into the scientific research, I came across all kinds of fascinating research that you wouldn't hear typically in some kind of business seminar including as I branched out into a whole range of different disciplines, the research on resilience and the physiological component of resilience. So when I left the trauma world or the clinical world and started working in the training organizational development world, I translated those principles into what organizations can do to create a high performance, low stress, and very resilient culture, and then continued doing the work that I'd done for years on individual resilience. I'll talk more about the mind-body medicine background a little bit later. But also more importantly, on the personal level, I've been working in the area of stress management and building resilience for, well, over 40 years now at a personal level. Something I really needed to develop as a young person. And when I saw the difference that it could make, it really lit a fire of passion to learn more and to practice the various techniques and disciplines and methodologies I learned over the years. So I'm very much a ongoing learner in this and fellow student as you are. So let's talk about how to shift your emotional state to an empowered, I can do this state. So this is where understanding the mind-body connection is so important. So when I was in the mind-body connection field, one of the things that really hit me was the unidirectional attitude or perspective most people had when they talked about how the mind and body were connected and how they communicated. Typically, people thought about how our thoughts affected our emotions and our physical well-being. What they weren't really focusing nearly enough on, in my opinion, was how what was going on in the body affected the mind. And I think especially in sort of popular culture, that appreciation uh, is not there, and the recognition of how important it is to to deal at the physical level with the body if we want to optimize our mind and our emotional state. So let me give you an example, share this story with you. So this actually happened many years ago, but it's happened multiple times since, but this is when it first hit me. So I'm slogging down the concourse in the Cincinnati airport, and it was at the end of a long business trip, and I'm just feeling really fatigued and no energy. And you know how that feels when you're just exhausted and or you just don't feel well. And everything that you have to do just seems so big and overwhelming and daunting. So that's how I'm feeling as I'm thinking about all the things I have to do when I get back home and my to-do list and just feeling very burdened and beleaguered. And then, what to my wondering eyes that appear was a Starbucks. Now this is back in the day when I would guzzle down like a venti iced Starbucks espresso drink, which has 4 shots of espresso in it. So we're talking serious airplane fuel. So I sucked down that venti espresso drink, and within less than a minute, I'm feeling like this. And it's interesting because I'm just fascinated by human nature, and so sometimes when I'm having a pretty interesting experience, even as I'm in it, I'm stepping back and aware of the experience, and I'm thinking, "Wow, check this out." Just like a minute ago, I'm feeling like all worn out and beleaguered, and now I'm like, "Bring it on." This project that was feeling overwhelming, hey, I could do this, this, and this, no biggie. What about this thing over there? I could do this, this, and this, not a problem. And so I'm like, totally jacked up on caffeine. And I don't know if it hit me in the moment or I thought about it later, but what came to me was, notice what happened here. Obviously, nothing in my external world had changed. I still had all those things to do. That's obvious. More interestingly, though, I didn't engage in any sort of positive thinking or challenging negative self-talk or looking at the stories I was telling myself. Those are all super important. And in a future webinar, we're going to dive into those because actually those are probably the most useful tools in my own personal journey. And building self-confidence and lowering stress level and building resilience. But not this time. The only difference was caffeine. So think about that. Now, the moral of the story isn't like, hey, get jacked up on caffeine. It's to recognize the only thing that changed was my physiological state. And out of that, my emotional state shifted. Now I'm like all jazzed up and enthusiastic and feeling empowered and can do. So my emotional state changed. And because of that, because my physiology and emotion changed, my perception changed. And so I was literally seeing the world, my world, in a very different way, simply because of physiological shift. And so I want you to think about your own experiences of that, because that is a, a window into one of the most powerful ways of shifting the way we feel, the way we look at the world, and how we perform. I love this quote from Dr. Stephen Porges, who's very well known, well respected in the trauma world and the neurobiology of trauma. So our nervous system needs to be in a specific physiological state to promote bold ideas, creativity, and positive social behavior. So let's break this down. So a specific physiological state to promote bold ideas. So you think about it. If we're feeling overwhelmed or tired, and we have the biology of that, the physiology of that, we're certainly not thinking about game-changing ways of doing things or of reaching customers or whatever. We're just in this contracted, again, survival mode, and just like putting one foot in front of the other. We're not being creative. And we're also, if we're in we'll just say a negative physiological state. So we're tired, we're frustrated, we're overwhelmed. We're certainly not as positive in our social behaviors as I talked about in the beginning. We're not as compassionate, patient, etc. So one of the reasons why I loved, and this is actually where another source of where my work another source of my work and what informs my work is the world of peak performance and elite athletes. Because you think about it, they really need to know how to manage their state and perform under pressure and perform in really difficult situations. So all peak performers know your state determines your performance. So this big wave surfer, the only way he's able to navigate that huge wave is if he's able to maintain an optimal state. If he doesn't, obviously he could die. Now, I love big wave surfing as a metaphor for resilience, because there are many different ways it's a metaphor for building resilience and what happens when you have resilience. I'm just going to keep it simple for our purposes here. And that is this. You think about it, what the kind of wave that this guy finds exciting for me at my skill level would be terrifying at an end of life experience. So I like to say this is me enjoying the good life that is surfing in Maine, or living the dream that is surfing in Maine, because as you might know, the best waves are in the Northeast or in the wintertime. It was funny, the other day I was explaining to a friend why I stopped winter surfing a few years ago. And then in the middle of my explanation, it dawned on me, probably doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. It's pretty self-explanatory why one would no longer want to surf in the winter. But here's the thing, back to resilience and how big wave surfing relates to resilience, that the more resilient we are, the more we have a bring it on attitude, and major challenges and even crises in life bring out this fierce determination and what Southwest Airlines describes their culture as a warrior spirit. So that big wave surfer, he has like that bring it on attitude with the big waves. With me, I'd be like, oh my God, I'm going to die. And so the more you and the more your team members, your coworkers, the more resilient you and they are, the more everybody has a bring it on, we can deal with this attitude. So, okay, great, but how do you shift from an afraid, beleaguered, or disempowered state to bring it on and I can do this? So when I do in-person programs on resilience. And actually, I did it in the webinar where we just paused the webinar and I asked people to go play this video and then come back. But to the presentation. I really encourage you to pause this once I'm finished the setup, watch this video, and then come back because we learn through experience, not just simply passively taking in not information. And so this is a great way to experience right here and now the impact of changing what's going on in our body and how it changes our mind and therefore our perception. So this is, as you can see, Sarah Bareilles, her video Brave. So I encourage you to go to the YouTube and put in Brave, Sarah Bareilles, and go ahead and play it. And you might want to dance to it or just stand and listen to it and just let the music inspire you, let the words inspire you. And you can either just enjoy it and just feel pumped up, or you can listen to it and just think about what can brave me do? What can brave me do? So I encourage you to go ahead and do that. And if you want, something that I do in-person presentations is after the video is I have people just write down for a few minutes on their own some thoughts about what brave them, what they would try, what next steps they would take. So go ahead and do that and then come back to this presentation. Hey, you're back. All right. So number one is to use your body to change your mind is kind of the short way of saying it. Number two is recognize and reconnect with your true strength and power. Here's something that hit me several years ago about why oftentimes we feel so frightened and inadequate in the face of major life crises. We feel like this little person, I won't be able to handle that huge problem. I'm just little old me. And here's how I think about it. Unless you're like a firefighter or you have some other profession where every day you're having to face fear and demonstrate courage and realize how courageous you really are when the chips are down. So unless you have that kind of job, your everyday life, our everyday lives don't require huge amounts of courage. And so because of that, when we face a big life challenge and we assess our level of courage, what we're assessing is not our true measure of the courage we have and the courage we've demonstrated throughout our life. Let me give you a quick example. It's like the classic example, if you ever heard about like the little old grandmother lifts up the car to save her grandchild. Now, like, okay. Now, obviously, Granny wasn't working out day in and day out, taking steroids and getting all pumped up and huge. And that was just, just an everyday thing for her. There's probably nothing in her life that would indicate that she could do that. But because of the challenge that the crisis that was taking place, that it drew forth courage she didn't know she had. So that's point number one, is that we don't really realize our courage until it's required. Point number two is this point here, though, which is if we look beyond the last few months or few years and look across our whole life, we're very likely to recognize a bunch of experiences that we've had that we really demonstrated courage. Excuse me. And so we want to tap into that inner superhero of ours. And we can do it this way by thinking about or reflecting on what I call, if I could handle that, I can handle this experiences. And I didn't think I could, but I did experiences. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a moment because this slide is not necessary for these next two stories, but I want to give you two examples of these type of stories or experiences. So if I can handle that, I can handle this kind of experience. So one that I've used in my lifetime is the summer of between my freshman and sophomore year when I sold books door to door. And the fact that I did it still blows my mind. So here's the situation. I was living on my own and I was self-supporting. So I was putting myself through college, which meant I was poor. I had no money and I didn't have a car. And so I had to hitchhike to school to get groceries, etc. This is back in the day when people still hitchhiked. And I really wanted a car, but the typical minimum wage jobs I had, I wouldn't be able to afford a car. Well, a coworker, a classmate of mine, fall of my sophomore year, so it's the summer of my sophomore year, um, tells me about this summer job that he had selling books, that he made all this money and it was great and everything. And so I'm thinking, wow, if I made as much money as he did, I could have a car and go to school. How sweet is that? Fortunately, I didn't really think it through. And what I mean by that is you could probably gather selling books door to door is no walk in the park, but it was extremely unlikely for a job choice for me because I was so painfully shy and my self-image was so bad. I wouldn't even smile at a stranger. Let's say I was in the grocery line and you're the checkout person and I wouldn't say like, hi, how you doing? Because if you didn't smile back, you just stared at me, I would feel crushed and rejected. Trust me, selling books door to door, having somebody not smile at you, least of your worries. And so I grew up in rural Connecticut, lived a pretty sheltered life, never been out of New England. And next thing I know, I went down to sales school in Nashville, Tennessee, and then we're sent to Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'd never again been out of New England. And not only am I in a new part of the country, strange city, but also we had promised that we would start selling our books bright and early Monday morning. We rolled into Fort Wayne, Indiana in our Ford Maverick. You might remember that stellar automobile. And we had no place to stay. And the company had been doing this for over 100 years. And so they knew, they had the drill down. So they had a couple of contacts for us to ask like, hey, do you know any place where we might be able to stay? And so the contact that my buddy and I got was a minister. And he said, we called him up and he's like, no, don't have a place, but you can talk to my son-in-law. And he seemed a little, I don't know, a little strange about it, but we're like, cool. So we call the son-in-law. He seems a little puzzled by this, but he says you can come on over. So we drive over there, and it turns out, mystery solved, why there was this hesitancy. The place that the son-in-law might be a place for us to stay was a halfway house for the chronically mentally ill. And we were desperate to find a place. We only had like a day and a half. So we're like, okay, cool. We'll sign up. So imagine living this sort of sheltered, working class white bread existence, and now suddenly you're living in a house full of strangers in a very different kind of environment that you've ever lived in, and now you're selling books door to door, doing something that now is going to be scary. I was so petrified my first day at the job that I found myself in an upper middle class neighborhood. And again, I grew up in a rural area. I was so scared when I knocked on the door and the door opened. This is back in the day when people were at home during the day. I went mute because we had learned this sales presentation. Imagine this is my book. And I just went like this. I just like pointed, gave it to the person, the lady to read. That's how scared I was. Well, that whole summer, I was outside my comfort zone every single day. And it really shocked me how mean people could be to strangers. And it really taught me how important it is, and this is more for another day, but how important it is to work on self-talk, to change, to learn how to master, or at least get way better on doing productive things with your mind versus stressing yourself out and making yourself scared to death. But I share that story with you for this purpose. I kind of talk more about how it relates to resilience, and I'll do that in a future webinar. But I tell you what, that summer was brutal and an unbelievably awesome learning experience. And actually, in looking back, it really planted the seed for me to get into a career that helped people become their best self. Because again, I was like this really shy, low self-esteem kid. And like, that's not the kind of personality that would be drawn to helping other people and speaking in front of large groups. But um, being so positively affected by some of uh, the giants in those days in the personal development field and seeing what a gift that is, that really planted the seed. So when I am faced with something that's scary for me, I think sometimes of that summer I sold books. I'm like, if I could sell books door to door, I could do this. Oh, and by the way, I did make enough money to buy a car. It was a Datsun 510 station wagon, in case you were around when those were around. So number one, you want to think of experiences in your life that were really difficult at the time and you made it through, and to remind yourself, hey, if I can handle that, I can handle this. Number two is what I think of as the I didn't think I could, but I did story or experience. And I keep saying story because I one of the things I love in life is storytelling, and whether it's using it in presentations, because as you know, people remember stories and not just bullet points of PowerPoint slides. But also storytelling is a really wonderful communication tool for leaders to inspire their people. Anyway, so this, if I can handle that, I can handle this experience, which turns out into stories that you can share. And if I can handle that, I can. I didn't think I could, but I did stories. Those are stories that you can use to inspire other people. So let's say you supervise a team or you're head of an organization. So here's an example of I didn't think I could, but I did story. So about 10 years ago, I reached out to the executive director of a nonprofit and I said, hey, how would you like me and several other speakers to do a benefit for you, a fundraiser benefit? It'd be like an all-day inspirational event. She goes, I love the idea. Um, would you be willing to be the MC? And even though a lot of what I do is speak in front of large groups, I'm an introvert. And even though speaking in front of groups at this point, 99% of the time, I'm not at all nervous, doing sort of like networking things and kind of schmoozy kinds of things, um, not the easiest thing in the world for me. I'm not a real small talk kind of guy. So I had always avoided any sort of MC or hosting a panel kind of gigs as a speaker, because I thought, like, I can't do that. That's not in my skill set. Again, I'm not smooth. I'm not a schmoozer, etc. I'm like, if I'm passionate about a topic, I can do that, but not this. So when she asked me that, I'm like, inside, I'm like, no. But I'm also thinking like, hey, put your big boy pants on. You offered to do this. She's clearly doesn't want to be MC. So I'm like, and I'm thinking like, this is also a good growth opportunity. All right, I'll do it. So I said, oh, sure. So I both speak and I'm the MC. And so it was a wonderful group. It was a wonderful day. I had a wonderful time. At the end of it, a friend of mine, one of my friends who was there, said to me like, so what'd you think? I said, oh, loved it. It was such a great group. Had a great time. She goes, anything that stood out for you? I'm thinking, I'm like, oh, wow. I said, do you remember my talk when I said about how important it is to challenge limiting beliefs and not to believe everything you believe because it's not necessarily true? And she's like, yeah, yeah, good point. I gotta remember that one. And I said, it just hit me. All these years, I've been telling myself, you can't be an MC. That's, you just don't have it in you. And I've avoided that not only was I able to do it and it wasn't scary, I had a bunch of people tell me that I did a great job and I really enjoyed it. And then I said to her, and so now it's making me think, and think about this. What else have you been telling yourself all these years that you can't do, but you really can? And maybe it's really easy. See, you think about that. So that's an example of I didn't think I could, but I did story where the I did it was easy. I encourage you to be thinking about those examples in your own life, both of when you did it, it was like, oh my God, it was like really easy. Or if it was hard, but you still were able to do it, that's valid too. So let's get back to the PowerPoint presentation and and just move on from there. So what do you do with that? So what you do, trying to get the oh, okay, it's not working now. Oh, I see. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Is to think about what are some of your, if I could handle that, I can handle this, and I didn't think I could, but I did experiences. And then next steps, catalog them. I would literally write them down, but at the very least, be able to recall them. And then use them when facing challenges like right now. Like, hey, if I can handle the time I got fired and I had to find a new job and blah, 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 or got divorced or whatever. So you can use those right now. I would really encourage you to suggest to your team, especially if you're supervising a team, but if they're coworkers, to do the same, to catalog theirs. Now, if you're leading team meetings, it's a great way to shift people. If people are feeling really daunted or overwhelmed, to shift them into a resourceful can-do state. So let's say you're dealing with some major task, a really hard deadline for a project or whatever, there's plenty of opportunity for challenges to pick right now. And people are feeling low energy, daunted, to share an example from your own life of if I can handle that or I didn't think I could. And then use that as a catalyst for the team to be thinking of their own examples. And because of the mind-body connection, when we change our body, it changes our mind. When people recall those times, especially if they talk about them, it shifts the emotional state, the physiological and therefore the emotional state into that like, yeah, I did that. Empowered state, which then shifts the way they see the world and whatever they see, whatever current challenge you're facing. So that's using the body to change the mind.